right, well, let me be the first to wish all of you a good afternoon. Now that it is 12:01, I'm going to get us started. So let me start by sharing my screen. Can everyone see that? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah? Yes, thank you, Angela, for a thumbs up. Okay, here we go. All right, so we are going to talk today about kind of bringing everything up into the present moment. We've been talking a lot of history. We've gone back to the earliest origins of Christianity. We've talked about the Protestant Reformation, all these different forms of Christian Zionism that emerged, different eschatologies. So we're going to keep going with this, but I want to just flag again, if you have questions along the way, my colleague Katie just dropped a link in the chat that you can click on. That'll open up another browser window for you, or if you want to do it off your phone, we have a QR code, and that will allow you to ask questions or vote on other people's questions. And we'll try. I'm going to try my darndest to have some space at the end for Q&A. But I'm also not going to be tying everything up in a neat little bow today. In fact, I'll probably towards the end be forecasting a very chaotic future of Jewish-Christian relations in our time. And so a good place to start if you want to talk about chaos and religion is January 6th. And that's where we're going to begin. So, of course, on January 6th, 2021, you had the Capitol riot, the insurrection that was attempting to overturn our democracy in many respects. Many people have noted that there was a lot of Christian imagery that showed up that day. It was really a strange cornucopia of Christian expressions. So you had everything from a Catholic priest who said he went into the Capitol in order to cast a demon out of the Senate chamber. Claims he was successful. And you had people walking around with such a wide variety. I've spent the last couple years immersed in this imagery. You have the Jesus with a MAGA hat on, Make America Great Again hat on, kind of classic Jesus picture, but then they've superimposed Trump onto Jesus. You had a Latter-day Saint guy who dressed up as Captain Moroni, a character from the Book of Mormon, right? Very eclectic. You have a guy with skeleton gloves for some reason, but he's holding a Bible, right? Very prominently displaying this symbol, the Christian Bible. You have many signs that day about Jesus saves. You could query, what does Jesus saves have to do with the insurrection? You had people with big banners and big flags saying Jesus 2020, right? Even as they're trying to have Trump win the 2020 election, they're carrying around signs and banners about Jesus 2020. So, right, a lot of strange Christian imagery showing up that day. And it probably won't surprise anyone who's even followed a little bit along with some of the coverage of January 6th. There's quite a bit of anti-Semitism that was also present in the crowd. Maybe the most famous, maybe the most infamous, most overt expression of anti-Semitism that has gotten a lot of traction is this guy who was wearing a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt or sweatshirt, right? Basically kind of making a joke about Auschwitz and saying he's in favor of Auschwitz. Is a very, very strange image. But you also had a number of people showing up that day with Crusader crosses. And if you were able to join us for our course that we did in January on the Crusades, if not, I would encourage you to go back and watch those videos. They are in our YouTube channel. But right, the Crusades are moments of incredible violence against Jews and against Muslims. And you have this guy wearing a Crusade Cross t-shirt. You have this flag in the top right corner that it actually says Deus Vult on it, which is the kind of slogan of the Crusades. In Latin, God wills it, right? You have these other guys that are carrying around Crusader flags. So at least 5 people got up on the morning of January 6th to go to the Capitol, to go to the Trump rally, and said, you know what I really need here is my Crusade memorabilia. Right? Why is that significant for that day? The more subtle forms of anti-Semitism that show up that day are really centered around QAnon, right? I'm not going to get into it all here, but I don't think you can understand the phenomenon of QAnon without the undergirding, the superstructure of Christian anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, right? QAnon is just in many ways translating the tropes of Christian anti-Semitism into this global elite, this cosmopolitan elite that is often just code for Jews, but sometimes they'll expand it beyond Jews, but it's really just kind of translating some of these very deep, very, very troublesome elements of Christian anti-Semitism into more of a conspiracy theory around people, celebrities, right? Now, it probably won't surprise you, though, if you've been attending the last two sessions, that there are also a number of expressions of philo-Semitism that show up on January 6th, Christian philo-Semitism. And as we've talked about, it's not, I'm not in any way trying to make the case that anti-Semitism is bad and philo-Semitism is good. In many ways, they're just two sides of the same coin, right? That are as we've talked about, kind of baked into the Christian tradition, to mix our metaphors, from a very, very early moment, kind of scars of this Christian emergence from Judaism, and of the troubled relationships that were there. Some people like to pithily say philo-Semites are just anti-Semites who like Jews. Right, philo-Semitism still takes on conspiracy theories, still takes on kind of exaggerated notions about Jews and Judaism, but it's just framed in a more positive way, maybe equally damaging in certain respects. So one of the strange things, a strange phenomenon you find on January 6th is there were a number of people carrying flags of the state of Israel. Why? What is the possible connection between Israeli statehood and storming the U.S. Capitol? Right, but you have multiple people doing that. In fact, the guy that you see on the bottom picture here, he's got a flagpole with the Israeli flag, and then he has a sign that says, "Say yes to Jesus." What is the connection between the flag of the state of Israel and an instruction to say yes to Jesus? Right. Another thing that has gotten some traction in the news is there were a lot of people on January 6th blowing shofars. Right, people showing up at the Capitol to carrying these instruments, right? A shofar is it's a ram's horn. It's used in Jewish liturgy, especially around the high holidays. But these people are not Jews who are blowing the shofar on January 6th. In fact, if you look at this image here of these two women on the bottom left, this photo was actually taken by a freelance Jewish photographer, an Israeli photographer who was in Washington, D.C. that day, went down to the Capitol, started taking photos. His name is Lloyd Wolf. And he was trying to capture the protests, and he approaches these women, recognizing that they're blowing shofars. And in fact, the woman on the left there is wearing a talit, a Jewish prayer shawl. And so he approaches them and says to these women, "Are you going to blow the three shevarim?" Which is right. It's a kind of a triple blast of the shofar that occurs during the high holidays. And the women looked at him like they have no idea what he's talking about, because they're not Jewish, right? They don't know what the rituals are around the high holidays because they aren't Jewish. These are Christians. In fact, the woman on the left there is wearing a talit that you can actually, I'll drop the link into the chat at the risk of distracting you, but you can look this talit up on Amazon, right? And it's a Messianic Jewish talit. It has stuff about Jesus on this talit. So this is not a Jewish prayer shawl, it's a Messianic Jewish prayer shawl. And Lloyd Wolf even captured one of these women going up to the broken out windows of the Capitol and blowing her shofar into the Capitol, right? Into this Capitol building that's been violated by the rioters. She's blowing her shofar to that. What's going on with this, right? I'll also just note, ICGS has actually been in touch with Lloyd Wolf, this photographer, because we really love his photography. And as somebody who spends a lot of time with January 6th, ideas and photographs, his are some of the best photographs from that day. And we've licensed some of his photos to use with our courses, and he's very supportive of what we do. But he talks about what a strange experience it was being there that day as a Jewish person. Now, you also have this man. His name is Michael Stepikoff. He's a Messianic rabbi from Florida. And he actually went into the Capitol that day as part of the riot and was later arrested and prosecuted. And many of the press stories about Michael Stepikoff and this Messianic rabbi who got caught up in the riot have just kind of brushed off this identity of him as a Messianic rabbi, or chalked it up, wow, it was a really eclectic, strange crowd that was there. But I think that Stepikoff's presence there that day is actually very significant. You see, if you go back in the month before, January 6th, there was a major event that in many ways prefigured January 6th, and it was called the Jericho March. It happened on December 12th, 2020. So again, just a few weeks before January 6th. And at the Jericho March, which was a big kind of Christian prayer and worship and protest rally that happened, a pro-Trump rally, happens on December 12th in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall. And but even in the branding of the Jericho March, right, you can see the slogan, "Let the church roar," explicitly Christian in its kind of reference. And yet next to the cross up in the corner of the symbols, you have a Star of David. So even as they are claiming that this is an event about letting the church roar, they're also saying it's somehow a Jewish event, right? You had a guy participating that day blowing two shofars, right? A double shofar, who came from Israel and claimed that he had spoken to his rabbi and gotten special permission to be there because it was Shabbat, it was on a Saturday. And he said, "I got special permission from my rabbi to be able to be here in support of this." You also have two more Messianic rabbis. You have Michael Stepikoff on January 6th, but you have two Messianic rabbis who actually show up at the December Jericho March and speak there. This guy, Jonathan Cahn and Kurt Landry, both of whom are Messianic rabbis. And both of them on the day where it's December 12th, it's the second day of Hanukkah, both of them mention that it's Hanukkah, right? As they are speaking that day. In fact, this is what Kurt Landry says. I'm going to read it just to give you a sense of it. Kurt Landry speaking at the Jericho March. "It's the second night of Hanukkah, and we have the same problem and the same enemy that they had in Jerusalem. We have an oil problem. Oh yeah, we have an oil problem. The enemy is after the anointing. That's why Antiochus IV sent an army into the temple and said, 'Destroy the oil first.' But for God left one cruse of oil made according to the sanctification of God's kingdom. Look at your neighbor and say, 'You're a cruse of oil.' Let me tell you, oil isn't politically correct. Oil won't mix with watered down messaging." End quote. So you have, right, this Messianic rabbi riffing on Hanukkah, riffing on the story of Hanukkah, trying to connect it into this pro-Trump kind of election overturning message. The organizers of the Jericho March also were invoking Hanukkah, and one of the leaders gets up after mentioning Hanukkah, then leads the crowd and chants, "No king but Jesus," right? Not the most Jewish message ever. And then, of course, there's this guy, Jonathan Cahn. Jonathan Cahn, if you don't know him, is a Messianic rabbi. He's considered a prophet. He writes very strange kind of prophecy books, but they're New York Times bestsellers. I mean, he is probably one of the most best-selling authors in the U.S. right now. You probably have not read any of his books, but many people do. Many Christians read his books. Maybe the most prominent Messianic Jew in America, maybe the most prominent Messianic Jew in the world today. Jonathan Cahn was the keynote speaker at the Jericho March, talking about Trump, and he makes these weird connections between ancient Israel and the contemporary moments and contemporary America. And then after Jonathan Cahn speaks, everyone takes their shofars from the Jericho March and goes and marches around the Supreme Court building, blowing their shofars. How did we get here? How do we get to a point where Christian Zionism and Messianic Judaism are so symbolically linked to an attempt to overthrow our democracy? That's what I want to try to explore today. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit and doing a quick review of what you could call the American evangelical Christian Zionist and Israel status quo circa 1995, right? What was the bargain that's made between the state of Israel and these American Christian Zionists? And then I want to take us through, talk about a series of Christian revivals that are very important for January 6th, going back really more than a century. I want to talk about a miraculous war that becomes very important to these folks, and talk about the turning tide in evangelicalism's eschatological mood, connecting in with some of what we talked about last week. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up by talking about implications for Jewish-Christian relations in our time as we conclude. So that's where we're going over the course of the next hour. And just to foreground for you what my premise in this presentation is my premise is everyone who wants to be well-informed, everyone who wants to be well-informed about religion in the 21st century, and who wants to understand the most challenging touch points in Jewish Christian and really Muslim Christian relations today, if any of those things apply to you, you need to read up on Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity. It's one of the most important religious phenomena that is occurring in the world today. And it has a huge impact on everything that we're going to talk about here, a huge impact on January 6th, huge impact on our politics and in global politics today. And yet many people are very poorly informed about this. So that's where we're going. All right, let's talk about the American evangelical and Israel status quo circa 1995. So as I talked about last week, you have kind of two sides of this bargain. And Christian Zionism goes back a long way in Protestantism, with Christians petitioning and hoping for a renewed Jewish state in the 20th century. Now, if we're thinking about kind of 1995, so about 30 years ago, the world of American Christian Zionism is still predominantly premillennialist, right? We talked about this last week. Premillennialists are people who expect that Jesus is going to come back. Jesus could come back at any moment. And we as Christians need to wait for Jesus to come back. Our task is to evangelize the world and then wait for Jesus to come back and fix all the problems in society. So these are folks who are still probably a little bit dispensationalist in their orientation, but dispensationalism is kind of waning in its influence. But the people are still kind of premillennialist in their views about the end of the world. They're waiting for the rapture. And part of the bargain of premillennialism, especially of dispensationalism, is there's a central place for Israel and for Jews, but it's deferred, right? Israel needs to be reconstituted, but the Jews, we're going to wait for them to all convert when Jesus comes back, right? And so even though the premillennialists ultimately hope for a Jewish conversion, they're kind of waiting on that. A couple of very important books that kind of mark this movement. One is this book, The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, comes out in 1972. This is the best-selling nonfiction book other than the Bible in the 1970s. The entire decade of the 1970s, The Late Great Planet Earth is the best-selling nonfiction book. Now, you can argue whether it's nonfiction or fiction, because it's really a wild book all about contemporary prophecy and all the things from the Bible that are coming true in the 1970s. But Hal Lindsey is a very popular author. And then later on in the 1990s, you have the launch of the Left Behind series. I forget how many there are, millions and millions of copies of the Left Behind series. I think there's winds up being 14 or maybe even 20 books if you add in all the youth novels. Right? But you have all these expressions of rapture theology, premillennialism, dispensationalism kind of undergirding the Christian Zionist movement. So this movement is bringing its unwavering support for the Israeli state and the Israeli government and pressing the U.S. government to fund and support the state of Israel, and is also fueling the Israeli tourism industry, right? With all these kind of eschatological trips to the Holy Land to experience the state of Israel, experience where Jesus walked. On the other side of this bargain is the state of Israel, right? Which at 1995 is a militarily powerful but isolated Jewish state surrounded by Arab states. But it's in 1995, you're in a relatively peaceful moment, right, with its Palestinian inhabitants and neighbors. The Oslo Accords had been wrapped up there in the early 90s, right? You have this quote from Ronald Reagan, Israel is a land of stability and democracy in a region of tyranny and unrest, right? That's kind of the messaging about Israel to these Christian Zionists and really to Americans as a whole. And on the side of the state of Israel, we briefly looked at this a little bit last week, there seems to be this awareness of these evangelicals' theology and their motives, right? That this eschatology that these evangelicals are bringing to the table, but they're not terribly worried about that, right? Because this idea of all the Jews converting, well, I think the Israeli government is like, we'll wait for Jesus to come back. You Christians can support us, that's fine, and we'll just wait for Jesus to come back. Sure, whatever you say, right? So there's this awareness of kind of this asymmetry in the relationship, but they're not terribly provoked by it. And really, I think you can make a very strong case that Christian Zionists are functionally central to keeping the U.S., right, which in 1995 is the world's sole remaining superpower, wholly aligned with Israel. That's the bargain that is going into the 21st century. Now, let's start looking at some of the other developments that are going on that ultimately will change the status quo, I think. First is this Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity that I mentioned. Now, there's different terms for this world. Some people call it the renewalist Christianity, right? This is it's interested in renewing, kind of reinvigorating Christianity back to what they understand as the early ethos of Christianity. Some people call it continuationist Christianity, in the sense that they believe the supernatural gifts of the kind of the powers of the Holy Spirit are still present. They still continue into the present era. Some people call it spirit-empowered Christianity. These are all kind of referring to the same thing, this phenomenon of Pentecostal charismatic movements. Now, just like the identity of evangelical, it's very hard to actually pin down what somebody means when they say they're Pentecostal or charismatic, right? There's all these subcurrents, there's all these nuances and shadings. So we always have to be a little bit cautious in just painting with too broad of a brush. But overall, this is a segment of Christianity that emphasizes the supernatural, experiential, populist, cathartic elements of Christian spirituality, right? Pentecostalism is just known for its expressiveness, for its immersion in experiences of worship. And these are folks who believe in a latter day, right, eschatological outpouring of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. The Greek term for that they're using for gifts is charisma. This is where we get the term charismatic, right? So the charismata, the gifts of the Holy Spirit, these supernatural powers coming from the Holy Spirit, and they're inspired by the stories about all the energy and miracles and outpouring of the Spirit and what is called Pentecost, the birth of the Christian church. And so this is where the term Pentecostalism comes from, trying to recapture that energy of the early church and the experiences of the early church. Today, Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity is the fastest growing segment of Christianity in the world, fastest growing segment also in the US, and maybe the fastest growing religious movement in the history of the world. Right? And that is not hyperbole. The Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity has been a demographic explosion in the latter part of the 20th century. And I'll give some numbers to that in just a second. Now, when we talk about the Pentecostal charismatic movement, I think it's generally helpful to break it into kind of three segments. And these will be kind of what we're talking through today, right? So you have these three subdivisions. You have Pentecostals, which is kind of the original movement, the beginning, the starting movement. And then you have what are called denominational charismatics. And again, I'll define these terms in just a little bit, but just note them for now. And then independent charismatic, non-denominational charismatics. Those are the three subcurrents. And look at these charts here just to give a sense. You can see this in 1970, right? You have the independent charismatics are kind of the largest group, but they're about 44 million or so. And then you have about 14.5 million Pentecostals, about 4.3 million charismatics. Now look at 2020. Independent charismatics went from 44 million to 312, almost 313 million globally. It's about 8 times the size of what it was just 50 years earlier. Pentecostals from 14.5 to 115.2 million globally. Charismatics go from 4.3 to 281.9 million people globally. And if you project out from those same numbers out to 2050, which is that other chart, you can see almost 500 million independent charismatics, right? The movement has basically expanded 10 times what it originally was, even just less than a century before. Similar numbers amongst denominational charismatics, especially driven by Catholic charismatics, and then the Pentecostals gone from 14.5 in 1970 to 204 million in 2050. Rapid growth of this stuff, right? It's almost an exponential factor of growth within these movements. Now, just to give you a little sense of a timeline of where we're going, I want to start kind of in the 1880s, kind of late 19th century, and go up through our own time and end with the capital right here, as I showed you there. So we looked last week a little bit at how Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism emerged in the late 19th century, this impulse to create a Jewish state. And of course, the state of Israel was founded in 1948. So the first revival in these series of revivals I want to talk about is called the Azusa Street Revival. It occurs in Los Angeles, shockingly on Azusa Street. And this is seen as kind of the birth, or at least the congealing of Pentecostalism. begins in an African-American church, spreads rapidly to other churches, but this is where people begin to speak in tongues in the modern world. But there's actually a number of movements that are feeding into Pentecostalism. Those just emerge out of nowhere. So you have things like the Wesleyan holiness movement that comes out of Methodism, kind of this pious movement, seeking again to kind of renew the church. Is very, very important for the rise of Pentecostalism. You have all these eschatologies that we talked about, the premillennialism, postmillennialism, these things from 19th century evangelicalism, that's feeding into this. You have the tendency towards revivalism in evangelicalism, the first and second great awakenings. These things kind of feed into and create precedents for Pentecostalism. But there's another movement that's less talked about that's very important for our sake today that feeds into early Pentecostalism that is called British Israelism. British Israelism. Now, you might say, well, what is British Israelism? I've never heard of that. I'm so glad you asked. Let's talk about British Israelism. So it's also called Anglo-Israelism. If you go and kind of are Googling or looking this up, which I actually would really recommend people that go and read up on British Israel, incredibly important. Has very many dangerous and negative effects in our world today that you would be surprised. And we'll only touch on a couple of them today. So British Israelism is this pseudo-archaeological, pseudo-historical, faux racial origins belief system. None of what I'm about to tell you is true. Okay, so please do not take this as true in any way. It has been utterly debunked by science, utterly debunked by history, utterly debunked by archaeology, but people really believed it in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So it starts in Britain in the 1870s. There's some currents that go back earlier, but that's really where it comes together. And then it spreads to the US and Canada from there. And the idea of British Israelism is grounded in the idea that the peoples of the British Isles are the literal descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So the belief of British Israelism is that they have all these complicated narratives and all these interesting language experiments showing connections between different nouns in English and different nouns in Hebrew and Aramaic. But the entire premise is the 10 lost tribes of Israel, the northern kingdom, they migrated. You can see the map here of all these kind of intricate wanderings all over Europe until they ultimately land in the British Isles and become the Anglo-Saxons. So the idea of British Israelism is the Anglo-Saxons are literally the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And so you can see here on the map, the kind of code of the map, the logo there. You get some of these very elaborate maps coming out of British Israelism. But so you can see Anglo-Saxondom, modern Israel. And then underneath the inscription, it says, the nation and company of nations and the great people of God declared Israel should become. Okay. And ostensibly, this is a philo-Semitic approach that's opposed to supersessionism. These folks are saying, well, we're not supersessionists. We believe in God's promises to Israel. Except they then turn around and say, but all those promises God gave to Israel are actually for the Anglo-Saxons because they're the real Israel. Right? So it's deeply anti-Semitic, even as it's kind of coding as philo-Semitic. And note how, you can see this on the map of the United States. The United States and Canada are cast as descendants of the tribe of Manasseh. Right? They're using biblical prophecies given to the tribe of Manasseh to say these are prophecies that the United States and Canada inherits. Right? So now America and Britain don't need Jews because we're the real Israel. Right? This is again, this very strange kind of Christian approaches to Jews and Judaism. Philo-Semitism, anti-Semitism mingling together and spreading. Now, this idea of British Israelism then gets used to justify British imperialism and colonialism and America's sense of chosenness, because they're saying, well, of course the British Empire is ruling the world because we're Israel. God promised that we would take over the world, and now we've done it, and we fulfilled the prophecies, right? So it's a very, very kind of ex post facto history trying to connect the British Empire with the state of Israel. This is confusingly proliferating at the same time as you have the rise of Christian Zionism, right? So these things are growing up at the same time. Now, when it comes to early Pentecostalism, many of the early Pentecostal leaders are very influenced by this current of British Israelism. And I'm just going to highlight two of the important characters in early Pentecostalism, but there's actually many, many more. And if people are interested, I can recommend a good article on this. So one of the major figures is a guy named John Alexander Dowie. And John Alexander Dowie, he's an Australian. His family's originally Scottish. They immigrate to Australia, and then he winds up immigrating to the U.S. from there. He's a faith healer in the late 19th century. So he's going around doing big revival meetings, healing people, and he decides to found a city just north of Chicago there alongside the Great Lakes, and he names the city Zion. And it's about 40 miles north of Chicago, still exists today. And he lays out the city. You can kind of see the map of the city there, where it's a city designed to, in many ways, imitate Jerusalem, kind of laid out in a circle around this major square where you would have the big church or the temple. John Alexander Dowie is very fascinated with Mormonism. Mormonism is also influenced by this British Israelism, and some of the ideas coming out of British Israelism. But then ultimately, he rejects Mormonism. He hangs out with the Mormons quite a bit in Utah, and then ultimately rejects that and goes off to do his own thing in this kind of proto-Pentecostalism. So this is before he dies, right around the same time as the Azusa Street Revival, but this is kind of leading up to the Azusa Street Revival. And he claimed that he was a latter-day return of Elijah. And he even started wearing vestments meant to imitate ancient Israelite high priests. And John Alexander Dowie is very popular. He has a newsletter that gets sent out all over the country. Many kind of these holiness proto-Pentecostal people kind of travel to his city to spend time with him. And he winds up expressing his own skepticism and opposition to Jewish Zionism, right? He doesn't think the Jews should go and rebuild Israel because he believed the Anglo-Saxons would rebuild Jerusalem because they are the true Israel, right? So he's saying, we don't need Jewish Zionism. We Anglo-Saxons are the real Israel, and we are going to rebuild Jerusalem and fulfill the prophecies. Another very important figure is this guy, Frank Sanford, who was roughly a contemporary to Dowie, though he lived quite a bit longer. He actually saw Dowie, witnessed some of these healings and revival meetings that Dowie led, and decided he was going to try to do the same thing. So he starts traveling around the country. Ultimately, he settles in Maine, and he founds a school there called Holy Ghost and Us Bible School. But everyone calls it Shiloh, which is the name of the building. So you can still read up on the Shiloh community in Maine. But he founds this as the New Jerusalem, right? He's already kind of building up this idea. We have the New Jerusalem, and a very significant community in Maine in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Frank Sanford, similarly influenced by British Israel, and he starts to observe Jewish festivals. He's a Christian minister, but he starts observing Jewish festivals. He demands that all of his followers be circumcised, mandates mandatory Saturday religious observance of Shabbat, right? So he's trying to kind of incorporate these elements of Jewish practice, but all with this lens of, well, white Anglo-Saxon people are the real Israel, and so therefore we need to behave like Israel. So the scholar Joseph Williams, who is, as I mentioned, has this great article on this. This is how he kind of sums up. And this paragraph would probably read bizarre to you if I had not just given you the background that I just give. So here's how Joseph Williams sums this up. He says, a handful of prominent proto-Pentecostals, people who are kind of influential at the start of Pentecostalism and early Pentecostals at the turn of the 20th century, cultivated new conceptions of authentic religious identity directly tied to distinctive views of Jews in Israel. Experimenting with Judeo-centric forms of ritual and dress, these leaders merged eschatological concerns inherited from 19th century Protestantism and British Israelite ideas, equating Anglo-Saxons with the lost tribe of Israel. The end result was a highly racialized corporate identity that, despite its philo-Semitic trappings, tended to cast Jews as alien racial others. Okay, so that is the vibe of early Pentecostalism. Energetic recovery of early Christianity, also these weird racial ideas about Israelism and Anglo-Saxons and Americans and Britons are really the true Israel, and we need to use Jewish practices and ritual and garb in order to enhance our Christianity. Okay, so this is kind of the strange stew that is early Pentecostalism. Now, coming back to our timeline, so you've got all those things feeding into Pentecostalism. And in the middle of the 20th century, the energy of Pentecostalism, right? This kind of ecstatic energy of Pentecostalism actually spreads outside of Pentecostalism into mainline and Catholic churches. And so starting in 1960, again, originally starting in Los Angeles, you start to see mainline Protestant and Catholic Christians adopting the practices of Pentecostalism. This is sometimes called the charismatic renewal. I don't have a ton of time to get into all this, but it's very significant in world history. Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court justice, actually she's born in 1972, grows up in a charismatic Catholic community in the Midwest, is very much shaped by this spread of Pentecostalism into the Catholic world. And you still today have a very significant, especially globally, charismatic Catholic community that, again, is existing within Catholicism, but is operating more like Pentecostals in their theology and practice. And then you have, in the middle of the 20th century, actually the same time that you have the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, there's another Pentecostal revival called the Latter Rain Revival in 1948. So right at the same time as the State of Israel is being founded, you have the Latter Rain Revival. And this Latter Rain Revival, so the terminology of it comes out of actually the Hebrew Bible. Sometimes you'll find this phrase, especially in certain English translations of the Hebrew Bible, of the latter rain, right? And this is the idea is in the fall, there are the former rains, right? The kind of late, so the harvest rains, the planting rains, and then in the spring you have the latter rains, which give the kind of water to the crops and really kick off the spring. And so you have Pentecostals, because they understand these things prophetically. They believe this latter rain image in the Bible is an image of Pentecostalism, right? There was the former rain, the birth of the church at Pentecost, and now they are the latter rain, and they'll use this terminology. And they actually, though, are literally tracking rainfall in Palestine at the time. And so they're measuring the rainfall to see, oh, well, are we in the latter rains? And there's more rain this year, right? It's a sign that we are part of the latter rains. So this idea and terminology is popping around Pentecostalism. And then in the middle of the 20th century, 1948, you have this revival that breaks out in Saskatchewan, Canada, that calls itself the Latter Rain, or the New Order of the Latter Rain. It's very anti-denominational, very hostile to denominations, and saying denominations are a problem, we need to get rid of denominations, and also very interested in the renewal of the roles of apostles and prophets in the life of the church. And the latter rain leaders really emphasize this connection between, hey, we have this revival that's breaking out in 1948 at the exact same time that the State of Israel is being reborn. And they're already kind of influenced by this British Israelism idea, and so they're connecting all these dots. The literal State of Israel is being renewed, and the spiritual Israel is also being renewed in 1948. In fact, these three leaders that you see here, William Branham, or Roberts, and Gordon Lindsay, who are all very significant for the Latter Rain movement. William Branham and Gordon Lindsay are very influenced by British Israelism. And even Gordon Lindsay actually grows up. His parents are a part of that Shiloh community that Frank Sanford is leading in Maine. And so right, all these kind of ideas are all kind of cross currents and populating the same group. So this Latter Rain revival catalyzed and shaped what we could call the independent charismatic sphere, the independent charismatic sector. And it also modeled a form of Judeo-centric Pentecostalism that doesn't have necessarily all the racism of British Israelism. So part of what the Latter Rain does is they take all this interest and investment and philo-Semitism of British Israelism, kind of detach it from the racial theories in order to say, this is just about Pentecostals being spiritual Israel in parallel with literal Israel. And so from there, you have the emergence of this independent charismatic sector, right? It kind of forms and shapes this non-denominational Pentecostalism, right? And the independent charismatic sector, it's more freewheeling. It's more actually prone to extremism and radicalization, right? Denominations are kind of a bureaucratic check on extremism. But now you have this whole segment of American Christians and really global Christians who are very invested in this energetic ideas, very excited about Israel. Not a lot of checks and balances on how power gets used. And about 20 years later, there's a war called the 6-Day War in 1967 in Israel. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And following on the heels of the Six-Day War, you have another revival called the Jesus People Revival. And this is where these are huge and important moments for understanding Christian Zionism today and understanding what happens on January 6th. So let's talk about the Six-Day War. So in 1967, right, the State of Israel is founded in 1948. At the time of the founding of the State of Israel, a war breaks out between the surrounding Arab countries and the newly formed State of Israel called the Arab-Israeli War. And you have hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees who are created both by the founding of the State of Israel and then the ensuing Arab and Israeli War. And they get displaced into the surrounding Arab nations all around the State of Israel. Now, in 1967, the USSR is trying to cultivate ties with Egypt, and so they start giving them some intelligence, but it's bad intelligence. And they tell the state of Egypt, the government of Egypt, that Israel is about to invade Syria, which was not true. And this leads the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, to move troops into the Sinai, right between Israel and Egypt, right? The Sinai Peninsula that extends down into the Gulf there. And so in response to this, right, so you have Egyptian troops massing on the Israeli border. The State of Israel decides to do a preemptive strike, and they go in and take out 90% of the Egyptian Air Force in one day. All the planes are sitting on the ground. The Israeli Air Force comes in, bombs the airfields, takes out the vast majority of the Egyptian Air Force. And then Jordan decides to attack Israel, leading to a counteroffensive into East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Ultimately, 132 hours of combat, 20,000 Arabs died, about 1,000 Israelis died. And after this very brief kind of tetratal, you have Israel ends the war occupying the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, right, as well as the rest of Jerusalem. You have about 1 million Palestinian Arabs who are now living in Israeli occupied territory after the war. Ultimately, Israel cedes back the Sinai to Egypt in 1982 through an agreement, and then withdraws from Gaza in 2005. But still, you have today Israeli troops occupying the West Bank and the Golan Heights, which is the source of so much of the tension around Israel-Palestine today. So, but from the perspective of these millennial evangelicals who are watching this happening, this is miraculous, right? This tiny, tiny state, God's chosen people, get into a war with all of their neighbors and come out way ahead of that, right? So from the perspective of these millenarian evangelicals, this is a sign of God's anointing, God's blessing on Israel, and there's a surge in Christian Zionism that occurs after the Six-Day War because it's seen as a fulfillment of prophecy. And at the same time as this is going on, you have what's called the Jesus People Revival. Sometimes it's called the Jesus Movement or the Jesus Revolution. There's a movie out right now about this called the Jesus Revolution. I'm not necessarily recommending it, but if you want to do some more of the history, you could look at that. So this is a charismatic revival. Originates in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and is particularly amongst these hippie and ex-hippie youth. You have all these disaffected young people disturbed by the events of the 1960s, living in California, who all kind of warm to this vision of Jesus and charismatic spirituality. And this winds up heavily influencing the Vineyard Church movement, the Calvary Chapel movement, and this non-denominational evangelical world. And you have baptism, people getting baptized by the hundreds in the Pacific Ocean. You have, it makes the cover of Time magazine. And this Jesus People revival revolutionizes the world of Christian music, brings rock and roll and contemporary styles into evangelical churches. And if the latter rain revival 20 years earlier really catalyzed this independent charismatic sector, the Jesus People revival brings hundreds of thousands of energetic young people into it. And so, once again, coming back to our timeline, it is at this moment, through the Jesus People revival, that you have the birth of Messianic Judaism. Messianic Judaism is not an ancient movement that goes back hundreds of years. It is a term and a movement that is coined in the 1970s in the aftermath of the Jesus People revivals, right? So some of the background here, right? There have always been people who are Jewish who are also Christian, right? Going back to the earliest moments of the church. Jesus was Jewish. All of Jesus' early followers are Jewish. And so the really differing kind of communities over time throughout Christian history and Jewish history. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, you have a stasis that kind of develops, where you have the Christian Zionist and Protestant missionary organizations, some of what we looked at last week, like the American Society for Ameliorating the Condition of Jews. They're focused on converting Jews, but then typically think of them as Christians when they convert. And they're ethnically Jewish, but they're religiously Christian. And the most prominent phrasing for people, for describing this group of people in that time, was Hebrew Christians. Okay, so in the late 19th and early 20th century, this is the term that's getting used, Hebrew Christians. So you have groups like the Hebrew Christian Alliance that was founded in 1915. Here, this is a quote from the Constitution of the Hebrew Christian Alliance, that their mission is to provide for evangelical Christian churches of America an authoritative and reliable channel for how to best serve the cause of Jewish evangelization. Right? So the purpose of the Hebrew Christian Alliance is to be a space where, as Christians are trying to convert Jews, once those people convert, they can come and belong to the Hebrew Christian Alliance. And it can be kind of an affinity group within Christianity, but it's Christian. It's explicitly and clearly Christian and evangelical. Okay? Now, as you have the Jesus revival, there's a number of Jews who convert to Christianity in the midst of the Jesus people movement. The numbers vary. Some people say hundreds. Some of the estimates say thousands or tens of thousands of Jews convert. It's very hard to pin down exactly how many converted. But through these kind of hippie revivals, you now have all these Jews coming into Christianity. And a lot of these people, this is the aftermath of the Six-Day Wars. You have the surge of Christian Zionism. And so a lot of these Jewish now Christians are very energized by this idea of Christian Zionism and fulfillment of prophecy. And so it's these folks who start getting frustrated with this term Hebrew Christian. The organization Jews for Jesus, which was founded in 1970, is very important in this moment as kind of helping facilitate this Jewish conversion into Christianity. But these folks don't want to give up their Jewish identity and practices. They say, we're still Jews. We're not Hebrew Christians, we're still Jews. And so it's in this moment that this group of new converts into the movement coined the term Messianic Judaism. And they begin to take over the Hebrew Christian institutions and rename them as Messianic Jewish institutions. The most prominent one is that Hebrew Christian Alliance that's founded in 1915. In the early 1970s becomes the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. The Messianic Jewish Alliance of America is still the largest kind of organization of Messianic Jews in the world, or at least in the United States. It's part of an umbrella organization in the world. So again, Messianic Judaism is coming out of these charismatic Christian revivals, born in the 1970s in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. So in a moment, I'm going to send you into breakout rooms, and I'm going to ask you to try to categorize this. So try to pay attention, and I'm going to give you some options for how to categorize this stuff. All right. So how does Messianic Judaism operate today? Today, you have hundreds of Messianic congregations and ministries in the U.S. The largest Messianic population is in the U.S., about 250,000. You have dozens of Messianic congregations and ministries in Israel. And then you have a number more in the former USSR, so especially in Russia and Ukraine today. These communities are predominantly charismatic, right? And their theology tends to track closely with Orthodox Christian evangelical views, except that sometimes they'll use specialized Hebrew terminology to render Christian theology. So you'll frequently find Messianic Jews talking about, they don't like the term Jesus very much because it's kind of a Hellenized name, and so they'll talk about Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus, literally translating basically Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah into Hebrew. Or they'll talk about the Ruach HaKodesh, right, the Holy Spirit. Not a phrase that you'll find really in Judaism, but in Messianic Judaism, they're translating Christian theology into Hebrew. So, but still participating theologically within basically charismatic evangelicalism. Now, the vast majority of people today who attend Messianic congregations do not identify as Jews at all, right? They are attending Messianic congregations, but they are Gentiles, and they call themselves Gentiles. So about 75 to 80%, depending on the estimates that you'll find, of people who attend a Messianic congregation any given weekend are probably Christians, Gentile Christians, usually with a Pentecostal charismatic background, right? So we've already seen how this emerges over time, where Pentecostals and charismatics are very attached to Israel, even claiming some identity with Israel, and now they attend these Messianic congregations. Practices in the movement they vary quite widely for such a small movement. Most Messianic congregations will observe Shabbat. They often have their worship services on either Friday night or Saturday. They will observe the Jewish feasts, especially those that are found in the Bible. They have some innovative liturgical styles. They have things like what they call Davidic dance that you will not find in mainstream Judaism. And they sometimes bring in the Christian sacraments as well, especially baptism and communion, although often with this kind of Judaized, Hellenized flair. So you have all these elements of Judaism that it's almost kind of a cafeteria style approach to Judaism. They're picking and choosing things from Judaism, but then the base of everything is very much Christianity. And Messianic Judaism is principally a proselytizing movement with a mission focused on converting and enlisting non-Messianic Jews. If you ask Messianic Jews, and I've interviewed a number of them, they will say the Messianic Jewish movement exists to bring Jews into faith in Jesus. That's the purpose of the movement. That's why these congregations exist. And then to give those Jews who do convert a space to exist within a kind of Jewish Christian hybrid. So here is my question for you, and we're going to go into our breakout rooms and try to discuss this. All right. What is Messianic Judaism? How do you categorize this movement? I'm going to give you 4 options. These are all represented in kind of academic and other popular literature about the movement. And I want you to try to pick one of these. And I'm going to take a poll when you get back. Okay. So some Messianic Jews will, and some sympathetic Christians will say that Messianic Judaism is a form of Judaism that follows Jesus as Messiah. Right? So they'll say this is Judaism. It's just a form of Judaism that it includes Jesus as Messiah, but it's really Judaism. So sometimes you'll hear that talked about. This is just straight Judaism with this addendum. Now, most Messianic Jews, most Christians, and some religion scholars think of this movement as a sort of hybrid of Judaism and Christianity that blends together elements of each. And sometimes the phenomenon, the academic phrase that's used here is multiple religious belonging. This is not unique in any way to Christian Muslim or Christian Jewish relations. You have all kinds of different hybrids that form, or forms of multiple religious belonging. People who say, oh, I'm Buddhist and Christian, right? But they would say this is a form of multiple religious belonging that is Jewish and Christian. So that's another option, right? And most Messianic Jews are actually pretty aware of this. Sometimes in their messaging, it can sound more like the first option, but most Messianic Jews would actually be in the second option. They recognize that they are participating in both traditions and are recognize their closeness and affinity to evangelical Christianity. Most mainstream Jews in the world and some liberal Christians would say that Messianic Judaism is actually just a form of Christianity that is deceptively aiming to convert Jews. That all of this Jewish stuff is just play acting in an effort to actually just convert Jews to Christianity. So this is the most critical view of Messianic Judaism. And the last is probably the least popular option, but maybe the most academic option, is to not think of this as simply any of these things, but to talk about it as a new religious movement. Right? An NRM is this is the alternative academic language to avoid using terms like cult. A cult is just a pejorative, right? Nobody positively says, oh, I'm part of a cult, right? Like it's just a negative categorization that people use of bad religion. New religious movement is this kind of neutral academic alternative that says, look, there's all kinds of religious movements that emerge. Some of them last, some of them don't. And so we'll just call things a new religious movement to say like, hey, we don't know what this thing is yet. And it's young, it's energetic. We're just going to kind of say it's a new religious movement and put it into this category of things that we don't quite know what to do with yet. So here's your breakout room discussion question. Based on what you know from this course or from outside of it, how would you categorize Messianic Judaism? where would you put it in these 4 categories? Or maybe you want to come up with a 5th category. So we're going to go into breakout rooms. My colleague Katie has put this exact slide in the chat, so you can pull that up if you're like, oh, what was option 2 again? You can have the slide itself. And I want you to go in, quickly introduce yourselves. We're going to take about 10 minutes. And I want you to try to talk about this. Feel free. You don't have to land immediately, but try to kind of talk through these different options for how to think about this movement and where to locate it. Okay. So 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and I'm going to give you a poll where I want to actually hear what you think. Hopefully you have come to a perfect consensus and you're going to enlighten us. I am going to give you a poll now. And I want you to try to choose. I put them in the exact same order. So try to choose which of these do you think that Messianic Judaism is? While we're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. All right, we've had 60% of you participate. Wait for just a few more. All right, and we're up to 81%, 84%. I'll stop it there. So here are the results from our little poll here. So we had the first one, that a form of Judaism that involves following Jesus as Messiah. You got about 14%. We had 39% go for each of the middle 2 options, so a hybrid of Judaism and Christianity, that multiple religious belonging option. And they had the same 39% opt for this form of Christianity that's effectively aiming to convert Jews, and then 7% went for new religious movement. Very, very interesting. All right, so continuing on. So you have these elements of Messianic Judaism that then get introduced in the 1970s. And I would argue, so all the ink in debates about Messianic Judaism gets spilled over this question of, are Messianic Jews really Jews? And I actually think that is the less interesting question about Messianic Judaism. I think the more important question is, how does Messianic Judaism interface with Christianity? Right? You can have debates about what are Messianic Jews, where do they fit vis-a-vis Judaism, but I think the more important thing to understand about Messianic Judaism is, where does it interface with Christianity? So I gave this diagram the first week of, right, you have the trying to illustrate, Christianity is enormous, Judaism is fairly small. There's the complexities of how does a religious community of 2.4, probably more like 2.6 billion today, relate to a religious community of 18 million, especially when you have now a nation state at the interface and nexus between them, and that Messianic Judaism, which is a very tiny segment of Christianity, factors very importantly into that movement. But you also need to understand it within Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity, and recognize that Christian Zionism itself in the past 30 years has become a predominantly charismatic movement. So not only is it that you have Messianic Judaism, but Christian Zionism itself is predominantly charismatic, at least within the institutions and that interface with Christian Zionism and lead the way in Christian Zionism. They're predominantly Pentecostal and charismatic. So because Messianic Judaism is primarily charismatic, it's about 80+% of Messianic Jews, at least in the 1990s, identified as charismatic, and non-denominational, is situated within that independent charismatic ecosystem in global Christianity. So celebrity Messianic rabbis and prophets frequent charismatic media and speak at charismatic Christian conferences, right? Those guys that show up at the Jericho March, Kurt Landry and Jonathan Cahn, they're not coming out of nowhere. They're showing up there because they are charismatic Christian celebrities who are famous, who are being invited into speaking there. And so you have this entire world of charismatic media, and Messianic Judaism very much operates within that space. And you have these celebrity Messianic rabbis who, to be clear, are not trained as traditional rabbis. Some people just start declaring that they're rabbis. There isn't really a Messianic rabbi training program per se, although there are some institutions that claim to do that. It's all kind of helter-skelter, but that's how religious leadership works in the independent charismatic world. And so you have people like Jonathan Cahn, people like Kurt Landry, people like this guy at the top here, Kurt Schneider, who identify as Messianic rabbis and speak to predominantly Christian audiences, right? Most of the people these people are speaking to are not even Messianic Jews. They are charismatic and Pentecostal Christians. And so these Messianic congregations tend to be more oriented towards this Pentecostal and charismatic theology and developments within that movement. And they're not very interested in anything in contemporary Judaism other than the state of Israel, right? So it's functioning within a Christian biosphere in many ways, but with this intention of converting Jewish people. And this also means that the latent Judeo-centric and Christian Zionist impulses of Pentecostal and charismatic Christians begin to cross-pollinate with Messianic Judaism, allowing for more free-flowing forms of Christian adoption of Jewish practices. Why are all these Christians blowing shofars on January 6th? Why are all these Christians wearing tallit? Why are they participating in Jewish festivals and using Hebrew calendars? I think it's largely because of this role of Messianic Judaism within charismatic Christianity that gives these Christians a sense of license that these practices are ours too. Last point about these shifts that we've seen is I think we are experiencing right now a turning tide in evangelicals' eschatological mood. I tried to make the case last week that while if you read up on the literature on premillennialism and postmillennialism, it makes it sound like these things are opposite theologies that are constantly arguing with each other. But in fact, they're more like moods or temperaments of evangelical theology. And so modern premillennialism, especially dispensationalism, right, which is a subset of premillennialism, is built upon Christians' post-Civil War pessimism about society and culture. And so the reason premillennialism comes to such prominence in the evangelical community in the 20th century is they think that the world is going to hell in a handbasket and Jesus needs to come back and fix and judge the world and convert all the Jews. That is the role of Jesus in this eschatological vision of dispensationalism. But Messianic Judaism and charismatic spirituality are actually very hard to square with dispensationalism. They don't fit together very well because the Pentecostals and charismatics believe we are living through this great revival at the end of time. Well, that's not part of dispensationalism. They think everything's going to get worse and worse. They don't think Christians are going to go through a great revival. And they think the world is just going to spiral downward. And yet, suddenly all these Jews are converting. I thought we were supposed to wait for all the Jews to convert, right? So these two evangelical theological systems don't mesh very well. So right now, I would argue, and I don't have time to give you all the evidence for this, but I think there's solid evidence, and you can kind of see it in some of the data. I think you're experiencing a groundswell shift in evangelical eschatology, right? Not so much a wholesale readoption of postmillennialism, but more trying to find a space between premillennialism and postmillennialism that's largely incoherent, but gets talked about as victorious eschatology. It's rejecting dispensationalism and trying to split the difference between these old things. So there's an important survey that was done by a colleague and friend of mine named Paul Jupe, who's a sociologist, and he started asking quite a bevy of questions about Christian nationalism in the US, but also about eschatological views. And amongst Christians, who this is just one of the charts that he finds. I can send out the link if people are interested, but very interesting stuff that he finds in the survey. But one of the things he finds is that a plurality of Christians, about 44% of Christians, still identify as pre-mill or answer in an affirmative on the pre-mill style question. But post-millennial ideas are still very present, and many people are blending them together. Now, if you remember, post-millennialism is much more invested in converting Jews now, right? Premillennialism, we'll wait for Jesus to do it at the end of time. Post-millennialism wants to build the kingdom of God on earth. And so you're seeing, even as you're having this shift, more and more interest in converting Jews now, and Messianic Judaism is very much a part of that. In fact, it is kind of the holding zone that's created for Jews who do convert to Christianity. They don't have to just go attend churches. They can attend these Jewish-feeling congregations that are Messianic, right? Okay, we have come full circle back to January 6th, and I would say that the leading edge of this eschatological changeover in the US has been the growing Pentecostal and charismatic movement. Pentecostalism and premillennialism kind of merge in the early 20th century, but they don't work very well together for various reasons. And so this victorious eschatology seems to be coming more out of this kind of the Pentecostal charismatic segment of Christianity that's really starting to take over. And that independent charismatic segment of Christianity, including the Messianic communities, were especially galvanized and radicalized by the Trump 2016 campaign. And they served as the key leaders in Christian Trumpism. And if you go back and look at the videos and photos of Trump meeting with different Christian leaders, the vast majority of people that he met with were independent charismatic pastors and prophets and apostles and Messianic rabbis. In fact, in one of the earliest meetings that Trump had at Trump Tower with a group of Christian leaders, that Messianic rabbi that I pointed out, Kurt Schneider, the one who's like introducing the Jewish Jesus, charismatic kind of celebrity dude, he is there meeting with Donald Trump. And in fact, it's a very awkward video, puts his hand on Trump's face and prays a blessing over Donald Trump. You can kind of see it in the photo right here. So, right, this stuff becomes very attached to Donald Trump and to particular visions of Christian nationalism. And Messianic rabbis have become key spokespeople for both American Christian nationalism and for Christian Zionism, and they interface directly with Republican politicians. In fact, remember Michael Stepikoff, the Messianic rabbi who gets arrested for going into the Capitol on January 6th? He's not some nobody. He was on the executive board of the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America on the day he went into the Capitol, right? He's at the top tier of leaders of Messianic Judaism in the US on the day that he's going into the Capitol, right? So I would argue that what burst into view chaotically and incoherently on January 6th was the convergence of Christian Zionism, this ascendant, victorious eschatology amongst evangelicals, Messianic Judaism, the insurgent, independent, charismatic sector, and American Christian nationalism. Those are the religious forces that give rise to January 6th. All merging and bubbling up together in this kind of inchoate way. So, as I wrap up, and then hopefully we have time for questions. I know there's a bunch of questions already on the slide. Feel free to add more in. Implications for Jewish-Christian relations in our time. First, this rise of Messianic Judaism has coincided with the global demographic surge of Pentecostal charismatic Christianity, leading to what Joseph Williams, who wrote this article, calls the Pentecostalization of Christian Zionism. Very, very important trend right now. Christian Zionism is not primarily about dispensationalism anymore. It's primarily being driven by these charismatic theologies and charismatic leaders who are very invested in the sense of supernatural, but who also don't kind of have all the hallmarks of dispensationalism. And this means, this changeover, both in eschatology and then the rise of Messianic Judaism, means that the original terms of the American Christian Zionist and Israeli government bargain are being tacitly renegotiated right now, right? Because that status quo from 1995 does not hold today, because the theological forces and the people on the Christian side have changed. So Christian Zionism today has become a global phenomenon. It's not only an American and British phenomenon anymore. Because charismatic Christianity is a global phenomenon, and because Christian Zionism has merged with it, Christian Zionism itself has become a global phenomenon. So if you go to Israel, the Christian tourists who are there in Israel, who are showing up for these different festivals like the Feast of Tabernacles, this annual charismatic gathering, they're not all white. Many of them are Brazilian or South Korean or from sub-Saharan Africa, all these places where Pentecostal and charismatic spirituality is growing gangbusters, right? There are Pentecostal and charismatic churches in Brazil that are modeling their church sanctuaries off of the Jerusalem temple and have built replica temples for their Pentecostal churches, right? This Christian Zionism and the support of Israel has become a global Christian phenomenon amongst charismatic Christians, all feeding into Israel. But that changes the dynamics. It's not purely this kind of American, British, Israel thing. And as evangelical eschatology becomes more assertive and optimistic, the goals of converting Jews into Messianic Jews and of building God's kingdom on earth flow together. So if the dispensationalists were all sitting around like, oh, we're going to wait for Jesus to convert the Jews, Messianic Judaism exists in contradiction to that idea. It's saying Jews need to convert now, and we exist as a movement in order to do that. Well, that really changes the dynamics and how we think about Christian Zionism, how the state of Israel thinks about these movements, right? How do you partner up in that kind of an environment? So we're seeing and experiencing right now, and who knows where it's going to go, a turning tide, a shift in how these different calibrations between the two traditions operate. So Jewish-Christian relations have always been messy and troublesome. And if you take nothing else away from this course, you can take that away. There's nothing simple about Jewish-Christian relations, and mostly, I would argue, because of the internal dynamics of Christianity. It's very little actually to do with Jews and Judaism and how Jews respond, very much to do with the internal dynamics and the theological arguments within Christianity. But the synchronized charismatic shift in Christian Zionism and the rise of Messianic Judaism promise to complicate things further in our time. And this is going to make for a very messy world. So let me leave you with just some of my lingering questions that I think about. And I don't have answers to these questions, but how will the Israeli government regulate Messianic Judaism and Christian proselytism? From the perspective of the Israeli government, Messianic Jews are not Jews, and they cannot make aliyah. They cannot migrate and immigrate to Israel and take on citizenship. But many of them actually have. They've gotten in through back doors. And so you have a prominent, not huge, but prominent Messianic community in Israel now. And there's impulses to proselytize Jews. How is the Israeli government going to think about that? Will support for Israel among Christians in the US continue to become politically polarized? 60 years ago, Israel, bipartisan issue. Today, it's become much more associated with right-wing politics. Is that a trend that's going to continue? And if so, what are the implications long-term for the relationship between the United States and Israel? What are the implications for these other places where Christian Zionism is emerging around the globe and their relationship with Israel, right? That's a messy picture. And lastly, how far can Zionists and Christian nationalists go in making common cause, and where do their goals and visions depart? I don't know, but it's an important question. Okay, I'm going to stop there and try to take on some of the questions that are here in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to try to take these somewhat in order, but feel free to jump in there and vote them up as they go. So Joseph writes, are you aware that providing a normative element to Messianic Jews has direct ramifications in the Jewish community? They cannot join our congregations. And I would say they actually don't really want to. Most Messianic Jews are very content being Messianic Jews. They're not interested in joining Jewish communities. If you want an interesting book, if you want to read up on Messianic Judaism, there's this book, Messianic Judaism, by Dan Cohen-Sherbach, who's a Reform rabbi, who I would say is the person within the American Jewish community who has done the most work in trying to understand Messianic Judaism. And he actually comes to the conclusion, controversially, that Messianic Judaism should be accepted as a form of Judaism by everyone except Orthodox Jews, because Orthodox Jews have very clear standards for what it means to be a Jew. And Dan Cohen-Sherbach argues Reform and conservative and Reconstructionist and renewalist Jews actually don't have clear definitions of what it means to be a Jew. They don't have these strict boundaries around it. And so why couldn't we accept Messianic Jews? Again, it's a controversial book, but it's one of the deeper dives I've seen from within the Jewish community into the Messianic community. He's definitely an outlier in that opinion, though. Okay, so somebody commented, there's no such animal as a Jewish Christian or a Christian Jew. It's one or the other. The two are separate and always will be, at least theologically. And I would just say that's not necessarily true. I mean, you can make a statement about that, but that's a theological statement, right? You are saying something about either Jewish theology or Christian theology prohibits this blending. The reality on the ground is people blend religions all the time, right? There are a lot of Jewish people who adopt practices from Buddhism. There are people who say, I am a Muslim Christian, There are people who say, I am a Hindu Christian, right? Like, people do it, right? You can poke theological holes in their doing it, but they're doing it, right? And so I would say, objectively, it's a thing that happens in the world. You can critique it theologically, but it's a thing that happens. And so I think our communities pragmatically and practically have to deal with it. We have to recognize that this is a phenomenon that occurs as religions operate in the world. Somebody asked the question of what is a Messianic rabbi, and I tried to answer that a little bit. Again, there are Messianic Jewish institutes and schools that will train people in Messianic Judaism, but there's no formal system to become a Messianic rabbi. It really is a question of kind of recognition by the community. I will say, a lot of people who identify as Messianic Jews have very questionable attachments to Judaism, right? Many of them are, as one person put it in an interview who grew up in these communities, in an interview with me, put it, there's a lot of people shaking the family tree to try to find some Judaism somewhere. And the Messianic Jewish definition of what it means to be a Jew is much more capacious than most definitions. So they would say anyone who has one Jewish parent who identified in some way with Judaism is Jewish, which is a very broad definition of what it means to be Jewish. But even by those definitions, a lot of people who participate in these congregations don't even fit that definition of Judaism. Most of the people who identify as rabbis have some background in Judaism. Either they were raised in conventional Jewish traditions, or their family has those connections. So people like Jonathan Kahn or Kurt Landry or Kurt Schneider do tend to have some deeper connections to Judaism. And that's part of the coin that they trade on in order to be Messianic rabbis or leaders. But there's no clear definition of what a Messianic rabbi is. A lot of people would say you need to put it in quotes because it's not a real rabbi. Who tells me what a real rabbi is, right? So again, I try as a scholar to allow communities to be self-determining and use their terminology as they use it, while recognizing that sometimes things can be authentic to their experience and authentic to their tradition, but also deeply problematic in the broader world of Jewish-Christian relations. Okay. So somebody also commented that the Sinai Peninsula is not between Egypt and Israel. It was part of Egypt. Totally agree. In 1967, it's within the borders of Egypt. But I will note, because of the tensions that existed, there were UN peacekeepers in the Sinai who had to withdraw as the Egyptians were mobilizing forces. So these UN peacekeepers were kind of standing in the zone between Egypt and Israel, kind of helping to keep the peace there, and then they had to withdraw. So there's an ambiguity about Sinai in that way, just as there's an ambiguity about a lot of pieces around Israel because of the unique circumstances of its formation. Okay, and is there any survey as to how Messianic Jews view themselves? That's a great question. There were some surveys done in the 1990s as the most recent that I've seen. There's been some ethnographic studies, so scholars who go in and do kind of an anthropological study of Messianic Judaism, kind of go to different Messianic congregations, study it that way. And so there is some academic literature, although it's not necessarily surveys and demographics. So the last data that I've seen goes back to the 1990s, when you really had some folks do some surveys within that movement. Again, it's a very, very small movement, right? 250,000 people in the US. So getting any sort of a representative sample, and then it's troubled by definitional questions. Are you surveying everyone who attends a Messianic congregation, recognizing that 75 to 80% of them wouldn't even say that they're Messianic Jews, right? They're Gentile Christians who are participating in Messianic congregations. Are you focused only on people who identify as Messianic Jews? And then how are you defined, right? It's a very hard thing to do with such a small community. So I can share some of the resources that are out there on it, but they're few and far between. And then somebody asked, what do you mean by a sense of chosenness? Is that found in many religious and ideological movements? So there is. I mean, you can talk about this question of chosenness, how that operates in different religious traditions. What I was referring to there is There's a strong tendency amongst Christians in American history to identify, I mean, this goes back to the Puritans, identify America as the new Israel, America as a chosen nation. In the late 19th century, this is fueled by this British Israelism. So again, it goes back a couple hundred years before that. We talked some about that last week, how it is that you have these early Protestants who are kind of proto-Christian Zionists who are also kind of imagining in a kind of a post-millennial sense that we are building the kingdom of God on earth and we are the new Jerusalem. But that tendency to equate America with Israel, or equate America as a second chosen nation, God's second covenant nation, sometimes people use that terminology, still very present. And in fact, a lot of the leaders who mobilized people for January 6th were doing it using the tropes of America as a covenantal and chosen nation. And saying, in order to fulfill the covenant, we need to put Donald Trump back as the president because he's God's chosen. And if we don't put him back, we are violating the covenant with God. So this stuff, again, is very deep in American history and American Christianity. We are out of time. Thank you so much for doing this course. I realize I'm leaving things in a pretty messy place, but I would argue that's where Jewish-Christian relations are today. So thank you again. Please keep coming back to ICJS stuff. We have an event even this week actually tomorrow. We're having an event with our friend and colleague from Goucher College, and Duncan, who's written an interesting book on sacred pregnancy and some of the ways people are thinking about pregnancy and spirituality in the world today. Sign up for that, come back to our future courses, and thank you again for joining us for this course. And I'll stick around for a few more minutes if anyone has questions, but thanks again for being with us.